In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed, not in a single battle, not in a single year. It collapsed over decades, slowly, then suddenly. The Romans living through it didn't call it collapse. They called it normal. Here is what is strange about every empire that has ever fallen in recorded history. None of them believed they were falling while it was happening. The citizens of Rome in 400 AD thought Rome was eternal. The British in 1900 thought the empire would last forever. The Soviets in 1985 thought the USSR was permanent. They were all wrong. And here is what historians, economists, and complexity scientists have identified, independently across decades of research, as the measurable warning signs that appear before every single imperial collapse in history. America currently matches every one of them. This is not politics. This is pattern recognition. Let's go through it. Before we get into the signs, we need to understand what science actually says about how complex systems collapse. In the 1990s, a complexity scientist named Joseph Tainter published a theory called the diminishing returns of complexity. The argument is simple. Every civilization solves its problems by adding complexity. You have a border threat. You build a bigger army. You have a food shortage. You build a more sophisticated supply chain. You have internal conflict. You add more laws, more bureaucracy, more institutions. Each solution works, but each solution also costs more than the last one. Eventually, the civilization is spending more energy maintaining its complexity than the complexity is producing in return. At that point, collapse becomes not a possibility. It becomes a mathematical inevitability. Tainter studied 27 collapsed civilizations. The pattern was identical in every single one. Now, let's look at the 7 warning signs and match each one to historical empires, and then to America today. Warning sign 1. Overextension. Every collapsing empire reaches a point where it is defending more territory than it can sustainably control. Rome at its peak controlled 5 million square kilometers. The cost of defending that border consumed an ever-increasing share of Roman tax revenue. By the 4th century, Rome was spending 70% of its entire budget on military defense. The British Empire at its peak controlled 24% of the Earth's land surface. The cost of holding it contributed directly to the debt that made the empire unsustainable. After World War II, America today has 750 military bases in 80 countries, more than any empire in human history. The United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. That is not strength. According to Tainter's model, that is the first measurable sign of terminal overextension. And right now, America is simultaneously managing a war with Iran, supplying a war in Ukraine, defending Taiwan's airspace, and running a naval blockade across the Strait of Hormuz. 5 simultaneous theaters. 1. Overstretched military. Rome did this too. We know how that ended. Warning sign 2. Currency debasement. Every collapsing empire has debased its currency. Rome literally melted down its silver coins and replaced the silver with cheaper metals. In 200 AD, a Roman coin was 80% silver. By 300 AD, 5% silver. The purchasing power of Roman citizens collapsed. Inflation destroyed the middle class. The British Empire, after 2 world wars, was forced off the gold standard. The pound lost its status as the world's reserve currency to the dollar. America's version of this is more sophisticated but structurally identical. In 1971, Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. Since then, the U.S. has printed money at a pace that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. The U.S. national debt is now $34 trillion. To put that in perspective, if you spent $1 million every single day since the birth of Jesus Christ, you would still not have spent $1 trillion. America owes 34 of those, and the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 71% in 2001 to 58% today. That decline is slow. It is also exactly what happened to the pound before it stopped being the world's reserve currency. Warning sign 3. Political dysfunction. Every collapsing empire reached a point where its political system could no longer produce legitimate, stable governance. In Rome's final century, the empire had 26 different emperors in 50 years. Most of them were assassinated by their own military. The Soviet Union's final years were defined by leaders who could not implement decisions, institutions that existed on paper but not in practice, and a ruling class more focused on personal survival than national direction. America has not assassinated its presidents, but the dysfunction is measurable in other ways. The U.S. Congress has passed fewer laws in the last decade than in any equivalent period since records began. The country has come within hours of defaulting on its own debt, not because it lacked money, but because its political system could not agree. A former president was criminally indicted 4 times and then re-elected. The political system is not broken in the way Rome's was, but it is showing the same pattern. Increasing energy spent on internal conflict, decreasing energy spent on actual governance. Tainter would recognize it immediately. Warning sign 4. Inequality. Past the breaking point. The Roman historian Plutarch identified wealth concentration as the primary driver of Rome's internal instability. By the late Republic, 2% of the Roman population owned more than half of all land in the empire. The middle class that had built Rome, the smallholder farmers, the artisans, the merchants, had been economically destroyed. What replaced them was a mass of landless poor and a tiny class of extraordinarily wealthy elites. Sound familiar? The United States today has the highest wealth inequality of any developed nation. The top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. The last time American wealth concentration was this extreme was 1929. You may remember what happened next. This is not a political statement about whether this is fair or unfair. It is a historical observation that every empire showing this level of inequality was within 1 to 2 generations of serious internal instability. History does not care about fairness. It only tracks patterns. Warning sign 5. Loss of soft power. Hard power is armies and weapons. Soft power is the ability to make other countries want to follow you because they admire your system, your values, your culture, your institutions. At its peak, America's soft power was extraordinary. After World War II, America built the international system, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, the WTO. The world followed American leadership, not just because America was powerful, but because the system America built genuinely benefited many of its participants. Today, every one of those institutions is under strain. America has withdrawn from or threatened to withdraw from multiple international agreements in the last decade. The Pew Research Center tracks global approval of American leadership. In 2002, 83% of Germans had a favorable view of America. Today, 35%. When an empire loses the belief of its allies faster than it loses military power, the military power eventually has nothing left to protect. Britain had the world's most powerful navy in 1900. It still lost the empire, because by then, no one believed in it anymore. Warning sign 6. The rise of a peer competitor. No empire has ever collapsed in isolation. Rome fell partly because the Hunnic Empire provided the pressure that made its existing weaknesses fatal. The British Empire fell partly because the United States, its own former colony, had become a larger, more dynamic economy that made British dominance structurally impossible. The Soviet Union fell partly because it could not compete economically with the United States running on a fundamentally more productive system. Every collapsing empire has a rising competitor that makes the cost of maintaining dominance unsustainable. For America, that competitor is China. In 1990, China's economy was 6% the size of America's. Today, it is approximately 75%, and on a purchasing power basis, it has already surpassed it. China has built the world's largest navy by number of ships. It has launched more satellites in the last 3 years than any other country. It is the largest trading partner of more than 130 nations. America has faced competitors before. It has never faced one with 1.4 billion people, a 5,000-year institutional memory, and a government willing to plan across 50-year timescales. Warning sign 7. The inability to reform. This is the final sign, and according to Tainter, the fatal one. Every empire facing collapse had people within it who understood what was happening. Rome had senators who warned about overextension. The British had economists who understood the empire was no longer financially viable. The Soviets had reformers, Gorbachev being the most famous, who tried to change the system before it broke. The difference between a civilization that survives a crisis and one that collapses is whether it can reform itself fast enough. The Roman Senate could not. The British establishment managed a controlled decline. They lost the empire, but kept the country. The Soviets tried to reform too late, too fast, and the system broke apart. America's question, the one historians 50 years from now will study, is whether its political system retains the capacity for the kind of fundamental reform that the moment requires. The signs are not encouraging, but they are not conclusive. History is not destiny. It is a warning. Here's the most important thing to understand about imperial collapse. It never feels like collapse from the inside. It feels like politics. It feels like economics. It feels like a difficult period that will eventually pass. The Romans living through the 5th century were not watching an empire fall. They were watching tax disputes, border skirmishes, political arguments, economic hardship. Normal things. The collapse only becomes visible in retrospect. When someone looks back from outside the moment and sees the pattern. We are not outside this moment. We are inside it. Which means the honest answer to whether America is collapsing is, we cannot know yet. What we can say with confidence is this. The 7 warning signs that complexity scientists and historians have identified across every major imperial collapse in recorded history are all present in the United States right now. All 7, simultaneously. That has never, in recorded history, been a coincidence. What happens next depends on choices not yet made, by leaders not yet in office, responding to crises not yet arrived. History is not a death sentence, but it is the most honest teacher we have. And right now, it is trying very hard to tell us something. If this kind of analysis is what you want, subscribe. I will keep following the pattern, because the pattern is the only thing that never lies.